Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. My name is Sam, and today we are going to be talking about all of the books that I read in October. I ended up reading 14 books this month, which I think is my best reading month. Maybe not. But I will say a lot of them were shorter novellas and quick reads. Also, before we jump in, just please excuse the lighting. I am trying my best with the gloomy, cloudy weather we're having today, and the sun just hasn't fully come up yet. So bear with me. Unfortunately, the lighting is going to be a little bit whack until it starts getting warm again. So without further ado and chit-chatting, let's just jump in and talk about the 14 books that I read in October. So I'm going to be jumping around a little bit and not going in the chronological order that I read them in, because I want to try and clump some things together. So the first 5 books that I want to talk about are all from my Monster Mash Readathon reading vlog. So if you want full thoughts and reviews, check out that video. I'll have it linked up in the cards. So the first novella that I read was Mated by the Two-Headed Viking King, and this was by Icy Cole, I believe. This was a very, very short novella. We were kind of just dropped into the story where our main character was in this cave and there was these like Viking demon things, and essentially they just wanted to produce offspring, and that was it. It was not great. I only gave it 2 stars. So we were kind of just dropped in. There was no like backstory or any understanding of why she was necessarily there or how she got there. But it was only like 30 pages, so you can't ask for much. The next book that I read for this readathon was Sacrifice by Katie Robert. This is the first book in a series or a trilogy. I am not 100% sure of how many books there are in the series. I ended up giving this 3 stars. I really enjoyed Katie Roberts' writing, but again, we were kind of just dropped into the story. This was about a half-blood girl who was half vampire and half human, where her father dropped her off in another pureblood vampire's home in order to let him feed and create little baby vampires. I'm definitely intrigued to continue the series. It was starting to get very interesting, but I feel like there was just something missing. The story wasn't really progressing at all. It was fun, short, but there was just, it was fine. The next book that I read in this readathon was Succubus Sins by J.R. Thorne. I ended up giving this 2 stars. We're following a succubus who is in a lesbian relationship, but she needs the male interaction and sexual desire to be able to feed herself. She's been going to this den to feed and get her fix to be able to survive. And she has these runes around her stomach that are somehow connected to her destiny, and she has to try and figure out who they're connected to and what they mean. My biggest problem with this book was that it seemed like everybody else knew what was going on, but no one was telling our main character, and she was also like not trying to learn anything. This is again a first book in the series, so I'm intrigued enough to continue after how it ended, but I'm really hoping that it's like falling into the like first book syndrome of trying to set up the story and set up the backstory and everything, and hopefully the plot just takes off, because if it doesn't, I might not continue. Then I read Sweet Vengeance. I again rated this 2 stars. This was a demon romance where our main female main character summons a demon to help exact her revenge on her rapist. Now, I didn't think that her revenge was going to be quite a large part of the story. I thought they were just going to kind of do it and get it over with in like the first little chunk, and then it was more going to be like the romance side, but it wasn't, and it was kind of jarring, and it was just a lot, and there's just some like smutty scenes that I was just not into. So this was not for me. Like, I liked the idea, it was a cool premise, but it just was not the vibe that I was going for. And then the last book that I read in this readathon was Halloween Encounter by Sibley Stamps. I ended up rating this 4 stars. This was less than 100 pages. So this little novella took place on Halloween, where we're following this girl who does not want to dress up and participate in the college Halloween festivities, as well as our male main character, who is an alien on his like scientific research to be able to get his degree, essentially. And he is monitoring Earth to learn about humans and what our traditions and stuff are. And he ends up having to come down to Earth. And they ultimately get together. And it was just so cute and fun and sweet. And I just really enjoyed it. So those were the 5 novellas that I read for the Monster Mash Readathon. Definitely didn't go the way that I thought that readathon was going to go, but I did have a lot of fun reading some monster romances. Now, getting into the normal books that I read for the rest of the month, I started off the month by finishing off Grave Secrets by Kathy Reichs. This is book 5. Yes, book 5 in the Temperance Brennan series. I ended up rating this 4 stars. I really enjoyed this one. Our main character, Temperance, is down in Guatemala, looking into a massacre that happened decades ago and trying to do some like forensic research. But then a recent body turns up and they have to investigate what happened to this individual and if the 2 cases or 2 occurrences are somehow linked. I really enjoyed this one. I found like I could follow the story. For the most part, there was definitely some aspects that I didn't necessarily follow the best, but it was really fun being in a new setting, and she has to travel back to Quebec, and I overall just had the best time with this. I love this interconnected standalone series, and as I've said time and time again, every time I talk about this series, I absolutely love the show Bones, which was inspired by this book series. So getting a little glimpse into that show somewhat is always a super fun time. Then during the readathon, I figured I would try to finish off this Percy Jackson's Greek Heroes. This is an illustrated book where Percy Jackson, who is the main character of Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, is explaining and narrating the stories of various Greek heroes. I also have the Greek gods version as well. When I was updating my Goodreads to mark this as completed, I found out that I have been reading this since 2021. So it was about time that I finished this. I ended up rating this one 3 stars. It was fun. It was a classic Percy Jackson narrative, and Rick Riordan's classic writing style. It was comedic and making the Greek hero stories accessible to the current generation of kids. My one complaint about this book specifically is like each chapter is a different hero, but some of the hero stories were very long, and with the size that this book is, it can take a while to get through that chapter, and there's not necessarily easy stopping points. And that's kind of why it took me so long to read it. It's also extremely heavy and you can't really just sit around reading it. So I ended up like binging the rest of this during the readathon in between my novellas. So this is also partially why the readathon didn't go super well, because I was really focused on trying to finish this. But I did have a good time, and I'm so glad that I have both of these copies. The next book that I read in October was Reminders of Him by Colleen Hoover. I ended up rating this 4 stars. I really, really enjoyed this story. Colleen Hoover is a hit or miss for me now. I feel like her books are very accessible to get back into reading. They're very quick, easy, and bingeable. The writing is easy, but the stories are not easy. They're definitely emotionally traumatic. I don't even know how else to explain it. They're just a lot, and I find that I have to be in the right headspace to want to read them. This was the last Colleen Hoover book that I had to read that I own physically. I still want to read all of her backlist because I want to be able to have a full understanding and full opinion on her as an author. And like I said, like I always enjoy reading her books because they're very easy to read and get through. Although the stories are a little much. So this story, I don't want to say too much about it because I was shocked by some of the reveals, but essentially, Kenna just recently got out of serving 5 years in prison after a terrible night and is trying to gain custody back of her daughter when she meets Ledger, who ends up being part of her daughter's life. I found that this book felt very realistic. Like, this could be a very realistic story for some people, and it definitely hurt the whole time. I was definitely rooting for Kenna since the beginning. The romance was good. I found the ending like tied up a little bit predictably. I had a few questions, but overall I really enjoyed this book and I would recommend it. But definitely check the trigger warnings. The next book that I read was Someone Like You by Sarah Dessen. I ended up reading this on my phone because it was only available as an ebook from my library. I ended up rating this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. This followed, it was very much a slice of life, teenage, growing up story about a girl and friendships and relationships with boys and friends and your family, and just kind of trying to learn how to be your own person. Like, it definitely, for me, like wasn't necessarily a relatable story, but just it was a very realistic view of high school and growing up and learning how to be your own person. It was just cute and a really hopeful story. And I really enjoyed it. I feel like I'm not giving the best reviews of any of these books this time. I honestly feel like I read all of these books a lifetime ago, and as soon as I finished all of them, just like thoughts out of my head, gone. The next book that I read was Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. Initially, I ended up rating this 5 stars, although thinking back, I might bump that down to a 4.5. I did really enjoy this story. For some reason, I didn't think that I was going to like this book at all. I ended up taking it out of my library. Genuinely, from the first chapter, I was hooked. So we're following our main character, Iris, whose brother has gone off to war, and she's been writing letters to him with no way of knowing how to get them to him. However, the letters just keep disappearing and they are not ending up where she thinks. I don't want to say much more than that. I didn't go into this book completely blind. I knew that it was about writers and there was some sort of war going on, but that's all I knew. And I think it's best to leave it like that. The romance in this story is everything. They're everything. They are so adorable. Their connection is so strong, and you can tell, like, from the very beginning that they're it for each other. I will say that there's a lot of people that compare this book to Fourth Wing, or say if you didn't like Fourth Wing, you'll love this book, and if you love this book, like, you won't like Fourth Wing, and things like that. But I want to say, in my opinion, these books feel like completely different genres. Divine Rivals, for me, it feels like a historical fiction with fantastical elements. Our main characters, everyone in the story is human, except for the gods. The war that they are fighting is a war between gods, and there are some magical objects that play a large role in this story. But other than that, that's where the fantasy ends, at least in book one. I don't know if the story is going to take off from here and maybe people somehow get powers or something, but that's not what this is. I would also suggest checking trigger warnings. I don't know if there are any trigger warnings or content warnings listed about this book, but it deals heavily with the war and experiencing the war. And there's some graphic and heartbreaking stories that are shared with the soldiers' experiences and, like, firsthand experiences of being in the trenches in this war. And it was very reminiscent of, like, a fantastical interpretation of, like, our First World War. So overall, I did really enjoy it. I'm looking forward to reading the second book, but yeah, don't compare. They're not the same. The next book I read was We'll Always Have Summer by Jenny Han. This is the last book in the Summer I Turned Pretty series. I ended up reading this 3 stars. I ended up being spoiled for what happened in this book before reading it, which was kind of frustrating. I think I would have been more surprised by basically the main event that happens in this book if I just went into the book totally blind. But this series was not for me. I think I would have liked this if I actually read it in high school, but everyone's just making bad decisions. The decisions that everyone makes in this book are not it. I didn't like particularly any of the characters, and everyone was just so annoying. I don't even know how to explain it, and I don't want to go into it because obviously it's the 3rd book, it's the last book in the series. But yeah, the love triangle was weird. I didn't particularly like any of them. I did like the way that it ended. People finally made some smart decisions. Yeah, the series was just not my favorite, but I'm glad I read it. The next book that I read in October was Cinder by Marissa Meyer. This I ended up rating 3 stars. It was very interesting, although not my favorite. I definitely guessed at the big sort of reveal, and I was kind of just waiting for it to be revealed in the story. But I really enjoyed this, like, sci-fi take on the classic story of Cinderella. We're following Cinder, who is a cyborg mechanic in Singapore, I think, somewhere in Asia in the very far future. And it was just a very interesting take on the story. I'm very excited to continue. And the last 2 books that I read in October are A Court of Thorns and Roses and A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. Emily and I are continuing our Sarah J. Maas rereads in order to prepare for Crescent City 3. I'm not gonna lie, these didn't quite hit the same as the first time I read them. I ended up giving Akatar 4 stars and Akamath 5 stars, although again, I think this one was more like a 4.5. Feyre really just thrives on luck in the first book. I really don't know how she got through anything. And then Akamath is definitely where it takes off. So if you haven't read this series and A Court of Thorns and Roses didn't really hit for you, definitely at least read the second book, because this is really where the story takes off. being back with the inner circle was definitely like, felt like coming home. But this series is really just, it's very simple. It's not a very complex world overall, but the way that Sarah J. Maas leaves little breadcrumbs that end up tying everything together. And I mean, this isn't even a complete series, so I'm sure there's a bunch of breadcrumbs that even at this point we're not picking up on. I will say that I didn't remember that the cauldron was mentioned so heavily and as early in the first book as it was. So that was very surprising to me. But this was so fun. I am having so much fun doing our buddy reads with Emily as per usual. And I'm excited to continue. We're in the middle of ACOWAR right now, and I am loving it. That was my reading wrap up for October, the 14 books that I read. It was a interesting reading month. We had almost every single star rating that you could have, a mix of genres. I'm definitely having more fun with sci-fi than I thought I would. I never thought I would be into sci-fi, but the last couple that I've read have been pretty good. Definitely tried some new genres this month and stuck to some genres that I know and love, and also had a couple rereads, which is always fun. Let me know what was your favorite book that you read in October. I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.